Now, my task is nearly over, but it's an enormous privilege for us to welcome Cambridge's 347th Vice-Chancellor, who became Vice-Chancellor on the 1st of July of 2023, who is going to chair the next session. For those of you who don't know Professor Deborah Prentice, she is an eminent psychologist, and her academic and administrative career was largely at Princeton University from 1988. She rose rapidly through the academic ranks, taking on responsibilities of increasing scope, chairing the Department of Psychology for 12 years, serving as Dean of Faculty for 3 years, and then 6 years as Provost, with primary responsibility for all academic, budgetary, and long-term planning issues. Deborah's academic expertise is in the study of social norms that govern human behavior, which actually has been a theme, interestingly, throughout today, particularly the impact and development of unwritten rules and conventions and how people respond to breaches of those rules. She's edited 3 academic volumes and published more than 50 articles and chapters, and has specialized in the study of domestic violence, alcohol abuse, and gender stereotypes. So Deborah is going to introduce my dear friend, Henry Dimbleby, and I will now pass over to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Fiona. Let me start by congratulating the winner of the Bennett Public Policy Prize online here, I hope somewhere still. Samantha, I think, right? Well done. So thanks to the Bennett Institute for bringing us together for its annual conference. Thanks to Churchill College for hosting us all here tonight. By the way, Churchill College is where Peter Bennett did his undergraduate studies, which I assume has already been socialized here. And thanks to Peter in the back there. We're very happy to have him here with us tonight, and we're incredibly grateful for his continuing support for the Bennett Institute and its work. Thank you. Questions about what we eat as individuals and how we consume food as a society have never seemed more prevalent. When set against a backdrop of austerity, a cost of living increase, a dysfunctional food system, and generalized mental and physical health issues, these questions become urgent. Henry Dimbleby has done more to help policymakers and the public think hard about these questions than just about anyone. He did it notably with the publication of the National Food Strategy in 2020, which studied the entire food chain from field to fork, as the report's remit has often been described. Because we are gathered here in Cambridge, it seems appropriate to quote a Cambridge voice for a view of this report. So I turn to Sir Partha Dasgupta, who said, and I quote, "Analytically tight, empirically thorough, the Dimbleby report is not only a masterly study of UK's food problem, but it also constructs a framework wide enough to be deployed for studying the food problems societies face everywhere." Long before he was commissioned to write the National Food Strategy, our speaker was already an authoritative campaigner for improving food standards. He is, of course, the co-founder and former CEO of Leon Restaurants. He also co-founded the Sustainable Restaurant Association and the charity Chefs in Schools, which brings restaurant chefs into school kitchens. In 2013, he co-authored the School Food Plan, a blueprint for government setting out actions to transform what children eat in schools and how they learn about food. It resulted in the introduction of free school meals for all children up to the age of 8 and cooking lessons being made obligatory for all children up to 14. For this important work, he was awarded an MBE in the 2015 birthday honors. From 2018 to 2023, Dimbleby was the lead non-executive board member of the Department for Environment, Food, and Rural Affairs, serving under various secretaries of state. Among many other things, he has been an advisor to the Labour Party on sustainability and food security, a journalist at The Telegraph, and a chef at a Michelin-starred restaurant. How's that for diversity? Almost exactly a year ago, actually to be precise, a year ago tomorrow, he published Ravenous: How to Get Ourselves and Our Planet into Shape. Co-authored with Jemima Lewis, it's a timely analysis of the food system, how it is malfunctioning, and what to do about it. Ravenous was very recently shortlisted for the Andre Simon Food and Drink Book Awards. I just pushed that, so I'm going right back. Food and Drink Book Awards. The winner will be announced at the end of next month, and we wish Henry and Jemima the best of luck. In the meantime, I'm delighted that Henry is here to deliver this year's annual conference and to tell us, quoting his own words, why political intervention in complex systems is so damn hard. Henry, welcome.
Thank you, Debbie. This is a kind of cruel torture to have you sit at that chair all the way through this. I'm sure it's a hazing ritual for the new Vice-Chancellor of Cambridge. One of the sad things about doing the National Food Strategy was, as someone who studied physics and philosophy at Oxford, coming gradually to the realization that Cambridge was by far the superior university. The number of people who helped directly, Partha Dasgupta, Helen Thompson, Teresa Marteau, Mike Kenny, Martin White, Diane Coyle, was really extraordinary. And I was, the quality of the thought and some of the arguments was very much the ability to draw, not to do it ourselves, but to draw on other great minds. So I'm rather nervous standing here today about to give a lecture about public policy. And what I'm going to focus on is not on the kind of details of public policy, but maybe try and explain why there are so many slips between cup and lip, why it is so hard, the most beautifully realized theoretical strategy, it's so difficult to actually turn that into action. Is that not working? No. Okay, I'll carry on. So, slide free, blessed relief, end of PowerPoint. So, when we started the food strategy, because I'd done the work on the school food plan, we knew that actually with public policy, excellent, thank you. By the way, Jemima Lewis is my wife, who's here in the front row, and there's a moderate dispute in our household about the sizes of fonts of our various names, but my defense is that's what the publisher sent, and she didn't question it, so she only has herself to blame. So what I'm going to try and do today is talk about, why things go wrong. So I want to look at, first of all, what went wrong in the food system and why, then the theoretical fix, and then the political complications, why it's so damn hard to make the theoretical happen. We started with the food strategy, realizing that we had to do two things. We had to tell a story, we had to explain how the system worked, because most policy actually doesn't happen in a kind of organized, processed way. It happens often as the result of a political moment where a politician thinks they need to fix something and they reach for something that is ready-made. So part of the job of creating policy and of making policy to life is to make sure the stories and the policies are sitting there ready to be picked when the moment arrives. And an example of that was I sent a copy of the part one of the food strategy to the CEO of Manchester United, asking him to send it to Marcus Rashford because I thought he'd want to read it because he'd been campaigning on school food. And I got a call from Rashford during that summer, and he said, I want to campaign for your recommendations on holiday feeding. And I was like, great. And then by October, he'd created such pressure on the government, the policy had been put into place. So we would love policy to be a group of clever people sitting down and making things happen. That's not what it is. And so the story you tell is almost as important as the policies themselves. And the story that we told, we started in 1945, and one of the great miracles of human ingenuity. So in 1945, there were 2.8 billion people on the planet. It was projected that over the next 50 years, the population would grow to 8 billion thanks to sanitation, medication, and medication improvements. And what the scientists at the time realized was that we weren't going to be able to feed ourselves. Up until that point in human history, basically back to the Holocene, 10,000 BC, these lines here show the green one is the amount of land we farmed, the black one is the human population, the red one is the number of calories produced globally. And up until that point, with a slight divergence just before the Second World War, end of the 19th century, we basically, when the human population grew, we dug up more land to feed more people. And the problem that was widely recognized in 1945 was there wasn't going to be any land left. We'd run out of land. And so if you look at the newspapers of the late 40s, early 50s, you're constantly seeing stories about Malthusian collapse, about the fact that humanity had run out of road, that the coming decades were going to be a story of starvation and of wars of resources. Now, the scientists hadn't reckoned on a man called Norman Borlaug. He was a botanist from Idaho. He'd grown up during the Great Depression. He had seen hunger close up. He had set himself a lifetime goal of curing hunger. And he found himself sent by the Rockefeller Foundation in Mexico towards the end of the war. And he wrote back when he got there to his wife that what he had seen had clubbed his mind. He said the soil and the standard of living here, these people are just scraping a living. I don't know what we're going to do, but we have to do something. And what he did was he had this idea that he'd heard about a short-stemmed wheat in Japan, not very high yielding, but with a much shorter stem. And scientists had been able to grow lots of very high-yielding wheats, but they had long stems, and when the wind blew, they blew over. And Borlaug thought, if I can blend this short-stemmed wheat with a high-yielding wheat, with a wheat that is resistant to wheat rust, maybe I can improve the farming here in Mexico. And he set up 2 research bases. He scuttled between the sea and the mountains, enabling him to have 2 harvests in a year, painstakingly cutting off florets by hand, tapping pollen onto other wheats, tying little paper hoods around them so that they weren't disturbed. And he would admit, as much by luck as by stubbornness, he succeeded. He created a new form of wheat. By 1960, when he left Mexico, that wheat, in combination with industrially produced nitrogen and new techniques of irrigation, meant that Mexico, which had been importing half its wheat when he arrived, was self-sufficient, was actually exporting a little bit of wheat. And that experiment was repeated for rice and for maize across the world, and we didn't starve. In fact, we now produce off slightly less agricultural land because when the Soviet Union collapsed, there was a lot of very low yielding farmland that just fell out of production entirely. From slightly less land, we produce twice the number of calories per person for 8 billion people than we did for 2.8 billion people back in 1945. It is one of the great success stories. And we say in the book that if there'd been a biopic of Norman Borlaug, he probably would have been played by Jimmy Stewart. He's got kind of good square chin, all-American teeth. But literally, unless you are a farmer or a food academic, no one has heard of this man. He is probably one of the 10 most important human beings of the last 100 years. No one knows him because you don't get famous for stopping disaster happening. You get famous for doing something dramatic, and just no one saw this. This perceived problem just went away. What Borlaug wasn't to know was that his method of production, by solving one problem, he created others. So the food system that we have today is by far the most destructive form of human activity to the environment. One way of looking at it is to look at the weight of all the animals on the planet. This is 10,000 BC, that period of Holocene, the stable climate that enabled agriculture to start, that enabled human civilization. There were 2.5 million people on the planet. I'm not sure who counted them, but it was probably some clever academic here at Cambridge. And they were dwarfed by the number of wild animals. If you look at this picture today, at the same scale, it's very different. So this is the weight of animals on the planet today. You'll see that the people have gone from 2.5 million to 8 billion. The wild animals, this is land-dwelling vertebrates and birds, have significantly declined. Initially, thanks to our enthusiastic hunting of megafauna, but even in the last 50 years, from 1970 to today, the number of farmland birds in the UK has halved as wheat yields have doubled. So this destruction continues. And in fact, since 1970, the total populations of wild animals are estimated by the WWF to have fallen by 69%, which, if that was human beings since 1970, it would be the equivalent of wiping out the populations of North and South America, China, Africa, and Oceania. It's unimaginable destruction. And the animals that we rear to eat, 80 billion of them every year, now weigh twice as much as all the people at any one time, and 20 times as much as all of the wild animals. And what this means is that the farming system is by far the biggest cause of biodiversity collapse. It's the biggest cause of freshwater shortage, of freshwater pollution. It's the biggest cause of deforestation, of the collapse of aquatic life, of soil degradation. And after energy, it is the second biggest cause of climate change. It produces 20 to 30% of the greenhouse gases that we produce, that we emit, and it's the only sector of our economy where that is not going down, where those emissions are staying the same. And that brings us to an even more frightening potential happening, which is the next crisis. So this chart shows what is expected to happen to yields, to food yields, in a 2-degree climate change scenario. And what you see is actually in the northern hemisphere, wheat yields are expected to go up. Wheat likes carbon dioxide, it likes warm weather, it likes wet weather, although, you know, it's obviously with a complex system, you never quite know. This last winter, it's estimated we got only about 80% of the wheat in the ground because it was so wet. But on balance, this is the UN and NASA think that wheat yields in the north will increase. But maize and rice yields in the equatorial zones in the south are expected to decrease. And so this map, when we saw it during the food strategy, looked like a bit like the concerns that people had after the war. This map looks like wars of resource shortage, mass migration, and starvation. And it's not just the environment that the food system is destroying, it's also our health. This chart shows the causes of avoidable diseases, and all of the pink bubbles are food. Food is now by far the most significant cause of avoidable ill health, dwarfs tobacco smoking. Chris Whitty was, during COVID, was giving lectures on the harm, for free online, on the harms that our diet was going to do to the NHS. By 2035, it's expected that treating type 2 diabetes alone, which is just one condition of diet-related ill health, will cost as much to the NHS as all cancers cost to treat today. And interestingly now, in Treasury, they are waking up to the cost of diet to our productivity. So the 2.8 million people who are out of work, Treasury thinks that the 4 biggest reasons for those: musculoskeletal problems, type 2 diabetes, hypertension, and mental health, 3 of which are directly caused by diet and 1 of which is exacerbated by it. So if you play this all forward, we end up being not only a sick nation, but because the NHS sucks all of the money in from the rest of the state, because we can't let it go down, and productivity goes down, we end up impoverished as well. And it's quite interesting, very noticeable at the moment, that it is Treasury that is leading the kind of the clarion call for actually we've got to do something about this in government. So that is what went wrong. We fixed a complex system and we created some other problems, very normal. The question then is, what is the theoretical fix? One, as I kind of alluded to early on, one of the most extraordinary things, has anyone here done, I know Fiona has, but has anyone else done a government review? Another one there. So it's in many ways in the Twitter age, it's a living hell. You get attacked for being pro-meat, anti-meat, like whatever it is, you can't do anything. You can't do anything right. And the lobbies on Twitter are pretty violent. But you have this extraordinary ability to ring up anyone, anywhere in the world, and get them on a Zoom and discuss how to solve the problems you're facing. So again, in some ways, the food strategy was an editing job. It was about reaching out and finding and watching these extraordinary conversations of people had in front of you about how you might solve particular problems. One of the easier questions we asked was when we thought about, that sounds quite complicated, how do we solve that? Everyone said, you need to use systems thinking. We're like, everyone said, systems thinking. We're like, great, we need to do systems thinking. And then we kind of went away. And they were like, right, what do we do now? And they were like, I don't know. So we then went back and said, how do you do systems thinking? And interestingly here, there is not a consensus on how you do systems thinking. And quite a lot of people pointed us towards this chart, which is which is known as the Foresight obesity map. And it maps out all of the factors that lead to obesity in society: social, psychological, economic, infrastructure, et cetera, et cetera. And it does a good job of explaining how complicated the system is. But actually, what do you do next is pretty tricky, other than go and solve an easier problem like the boats or something. And it's pretty toxic to politicians. They look at that and they think, I'm not getting involved. And actually, it was Ian Boyd in the end, who was the chief scientific officer at Deborah. He is a biologist, and he studies the movement of energy in ecosystems. So how does sun hit plants and then move through animals back into plants? And how do those ecosystems go wrong and break? And he said you need to go back to the work of Donella Meadows and Jay Forrester from MIT in the 50s. So he said this is one of the few sciences that came from business. They started using computers in the 50s to predict how systems would break down. And they were looking at commercial systems, businesses. But actually, their work was then spread into all sorts of fields, including his field. And it turns out that these systems often break down in very similar ways, even if they're in completely different fields. This is Donella Meadows. She wrote about, so she says, how do you deal with the system? She says, first of all, you have to understand that you cannot control a system. You can't really even fully understand it, a complex system, but you can dance with it. Now, what does she mean by you can dance with it? What she said is the first thing that you have to do is you have to try and work out the dominant feedback loops that caused the system to malfunction. By malfunction, caused it to do, from an anthropomorphic point of view, something that was not good for humans. And then once you've identified the dominant feedback loops, if you can, you work out how you can adjust them, how you can break those feedback loops or put in feedback loops that don't exist. And she then said, you really have very little idea about what will happen next, but that is the starting point. And the good news is that in the food system, there are two feedback loops that are going very obviously dominating the way in which the system's going wrong. On diet and ill health, there's what we call the junk food cycle. So we have an appetite that evolved in a time of calorie scarcity. That appetite gives us huge rewards for eating delicious Kentucky Fried Chicken, foods that are salty and fatty and sugary. And when those foods are low in water, when they are low in insoluble fiber, they fill us up less quickly. So we seek those foods out and we eat more of them when we find them, because that was the rational thing to do in the environment in which our appetite evolved. But food companies, not because they're bad people, not because they wake up every morning thinking, how shall we kill your children, although looking at this picture, I sometimes doubt that. They have spent increasing amounts of their research and development budgets, increasing amounts of their marketing on these kind of foods, and they have created a reinforcing feedback loop. They spend more money, we eat more, they spend more money, we eat more, they spend more money, and we get sick. And this is what it looks like. This is two huge corporates battling it out at children's eye level in a supermarket for a share of your wallet. And if you want to get a sense of the extent to which these foods now dominate our diet. 85% of the processed foods made by the top 6 food manufacturers are deemed by the World Health Organization to be too unhealthy to market to children. It's just completely dominated. So our food system is awash with this stuff, and it's not surprising that we get sick. The other feedback loop was called by Partha Dasgupta in his extraordinary Economics of Biodiversity review he did to Treasury, which is, if you want to read it, 600 pages long. And I have got bad news for you, which is the 600-page long version is incredible. There's like a mathematical calculation at one point, I think goes over 3 pages, about when we're going to become extinct, given the current rate at which we're depleting nature. And he, the civil servant said, do you think we could produce a summary? And he said, no, this is it. This is the answer. What do you mean a summary? This is my life's work. And they went, please, can we do? And anyway, in the end, the civil servants produced a summary, which I think he very grudgingly signed off. And the summary is really boring, and the 600-page work is great. But what Dasgupta pointed out is that nature is actually quite difficult to measure. It's silent, it's invisible, it's often underground, it's in the air, it's underwater, and it's mobile. It doesn't sit around waiting to be counted. It doesn't respect our borders or our measurement systems. But he also said, we don't even try to count it. It's not in our reward systems. So we can't count nature in a wallet. It's not on the balance sheet of companies. It's not in the way we measure GDP. And he pointed out that if you look at the last 20 years, our produced capital has increased by about 14%, and our natural capital has decreased by significantly more than that. So that is an impossible, that feedback loop ends, as he points out, in extinction if it's not stopped. And he actually points out it's not just that nature is free, it's not just that we give it away, and so people produce capital with it. We actually subsidize nature, the destruction of nature, to the tune of $500 billion a year, creating about 4 to 6, he estimates, $1 trillion of damage. We're giving nature a negative value. We are paying people to destroy nature. So we should not be surprised that it's being depleted at such a rate. And actually, that's good news in some ways. You've got these 2 feedback mechanisms. You know, how do you then break them? What do you do to break those feedback loops? The nature one becomes quite complicated because when you say, okay, so we're depleting nature, we've only got so much amount of land, we need to produce enough food, restore nature, and sequester carbon, that simultaneous equation becomes quite hard to solve. And one of the, again, if in some ways good news is that we don't use our land very cleverly at the moment. So if you look at this chart, this is the land we use to feed ourselves in the UK, about twice the area of land of our land mass. That's land abroad. And the yellow is poultry feed, the blue is pig feed, and the green is pasture and dairy or beef feed. We actually use about 70% of the land to feed us to either feed to animals or to graze animals, and that's an incredibly inefficient use of land. So actually, there is a theoretical solution to this problem. You know, you could change the incentives in the system to solve the problem. But how do you actually go about doing that? Michael Gove, who was the Secretary of State who commissioned this, said to me, Henry, I can only do 4 things. I can ban things, I can mandate things, I can pay people to do things, or I can tax them or fine them. I can take money away from them for doing things. He said, I can also make speeches, but I've noticed over time that's not a particularly effective way of getting things to happen. So you have those 4 levers. That's your starting point with public policy. Those are your 4 levers. And with the environmental side, the kind of first, and this is why I'm absolutely terrified doing this in front of Diane Coyle, but the first economist, you can give me notes later, Diane, the first economist who proposed a way of dealing this was the English economist Arthur Pigou, who in 1920 wrote The Economics of Welfare, and he invented the Pigouvian tax. Now, this was a time when the problems were different. So he pointed out that the factories were creating all sorts of problems for which they were not responsible. So they were making people have to wash their clothes more, he gave as an example. They were making vegetables dirty in the garden. They were making windows dirty, and therefore they required more cleaning. People needed to have electric lamps on for a bit longer because the air was much darker. And he proposed that actually, if you created a Pigouvian tax, then, and basically taxed the companies who were producing these externalities, these costs, then that would force them to move into different mode of operation, and you would see these problems fall away. Now, the problem is, in the food system, is that we had a large debate at the time about what food security is, what does it mean to be food secure? And as a government, the kind of simple answer is, it's making sure there's enough food at the right price so you don't get a revolution, you don't get kicked out of power. Most revolutions start when food gets scarce and expensive. And if you try and estimate what a Pigouvian tax might look like on our food system, these are 4 estimates of the total harms that the food system does to us, ranging from 40 billion to 94 billion. When I arrived to do this work, I looked at this and I thought, these are all done by NGOs. They've turned it up to 11. They're exaggerated. I don't believe it. We spend just over 100 billion on food, so the 94 billion would double the price of food. We actually, when we looked into it, came to believe these were underestimates. The Institute for Fiscal Studies last year estimated the cost of diet alone was almost 100 billion, and the environmental costs much higher. So if you were overnight to create a Pigouvian tax, you wouldn't be able to do it. You'd be the civil servants would write several letters saying that this was a bad idea, and then if you did do it, there would be a revolution, and you'd probably find yourself strung up in front of the House of Westminster. So it's just not possible. So Ronald Coase, in 1960, wrote a critique of Pigou's work called The Problem of Social Cost. And what he pointed out was, you slightly get the sense that he didn't want any intervention, but that's not the argument he makes. What he pointed out is that the tax is just one lever in the legislator's toolbox, and that actually you can subsidize, you can mandate, you can do other things. And so what we tried to do was follow the path of the energy transition. So if you look at the energy transition, this, on the left-hand side, you see the cost of batteries plummeting over time. And on the right-hand side, you see electric cars, an S-curve showing anticipated take-up of electric cars. And initially, on the left-hand side, they are more expensive and slightly more irritating to use. And you require government intervention to drive take-up. So you create the market by telling people that by 2030 you're going to remove all electric cars, then shifting that back by 5 years. You give subsidies, you create a market, and then over time there is a tipping point where the grid gets good enough, the cars get cheap enough, and the consumer drives it. And that's what we tried to create with the food strategy. So we had 4 strategic objectives, each of which had policies behind them, which were trying to rebalance, to break the junk food cycle and to put in a feedback loop that meant that nature wasn't invisible. So on the escaping the junk food cycle, breaking that thing, we put in place, the biggest recommendation was a salt and sugar reformulation tax, but also mandatory reporting, things that would make it less commercially attractive for companies to sell us this food. And then at the same time, helping people who were living in poverty eat well, and that included the work that Rashford did. It included the idea of, alongside benefits, having fruit and veg vouchers, which is fascinatingly, it's got amazing evidence for it, and we might talk about this later. Ideologically, everyone hates it, but it is by far the single thing you could do that would help that problem. And interestingly, the people who receive them really like them too. It's just the campaigners who fight against them. In terms of the environment, making the best use of our land, you need to create a land use framework. You need to decide which bits of land you want to do what, and then you need to pay public money for public goods, so pay people to restore nature. You need to put in the polluter pay principles, and you also need to have net gain on biodiversity. We're so far behind, it's no good just to keep the status. We need to recover nature. And then you need some levers to keep the change in, long-term shift in the food culture. So looking at the Stern report, one of the greatest insights that he had was that you create the climate statutory targets with climate change committees so that as governments come and go and ministers come and go, there is a constant ratcheting up of the pressure to make you act. So that's the theory. Why have the bits of it that haven't happened not happened, and what happens next? Now, I'm trying out a theory here. This is my hypothesis, very nervously putting it before you, and I'll take feedback later. Another brilliant Cambridge alum, Dolly Van Tullochen, and I are interviewing between now and September every Prime Minister since 1990 and every Secretary of State for Health to test this hypothesis. So we're asking them, why do you think policy on diet-related ill health has been so spectacularly unsuccessful? My theory is that there are 4 issues. The first is incentives. There is very little upside for a politician to deal with diet-related ill health, and there is a significant downside. There are huge ideological resistance. The libertarians on both sides will criticize you. I say on both sides. Tony Blair told us when we did the Times Health Commission that John Reid, when he was saying we're going to ban cigarette smoking, had told him, you'll never win a Red Wall seat again if you ban smoking. And then Blair said, no, nothing happened, no one noticed, but there was a huge ideological pushback inside my party. And he said that after Brexit, the next time he bumped into John Reid said, I told you you shouldn't have banned smoking, and that John Reid thinks that Brexit was caused by Tony Blair's smoking ban. So there's this huge ideological opposition. And part of that is because the nature of our country means we are able to hold luxury beliefs. This idea that the market will fix everything is a luxury belief. We can afford to have it. If you look at the countries who really have intervened on food, they are not in a context which enables them to have luxury beliefs. South Korea, this is the Korean border, with a nuclear state to the north of it, needs to have a healthy population. They have done a lot of intervention on food. Japan, who had the shock of opening up and realizing that they were much less fit and healthy than the rest of the world, major restoration in the late 19th century, and then had the war and the MacArthur years. They have huge interventions on health. Singapore, a tiny island, very little resource. They have big intervention on health and diet because they do not have the luxury of not doing that. They see the health of their populations as being absolutely essential. So the first is incentives. The second thing is uncertainty. So, as I said at the beginning, if you're honest, you really don't know what's going to happen when you intervene in a complex system. And this is something that Mike Kenny helped me with. I was saying that if you look at interventions, everyone at the moment, evidence-based policy in government has become a real problem because it is used not to do anything. Because people say, where's the evidence? And you say, well, you can't get evidence of a salt and sugar tax because you've got to do it to get evidence. And therefore, things get blocked. And Mike talked about actually moving from a kind of pure evidence to evidence-based policy. So you look at what the best possible intervention might be given the evidence, but you intervene. This is what Pekka Puska did here. That's him on the left. He went on to run the Finnish health service. He was brought in because Finland had the worst heart disease rates of any country in Europe. They were dying, men were dying in their late 40s, early 50s regularly. And he called it getting boots deep in the ground. So he did everything all at once. He's often criticized by evidence scientists. They say, well, we can't tell what worked. And he's like, well, I don't care. It worked. And I mean, he did everything from, working with sausage manufacturers to reduce salt, teaching, having cookery courses to teach people how to cook vegetables, because at the time vegetables were what animals ate. And so they created a new soup which had vegetables in it, whereas normally the soup was just butter and pork and water. Delicious. He lit snow paths. They had the most popular TV show in Finland amongst men was a competition between villages to see who could eat best and be the fittest. He did everything. And this is him with a random volunteer who hasn't been kidnapped. She's picking the winner of the giving up smoking competition. That was another thing. So uncertainty is a big issue. The fact that politicians are going to have to get used to the fact that you don't know what's going to happen, you don't know how the system's going to respond. If you manage to get through that, and you have a politician who wants to change things, you then have the structure of government. So this chart was created by an amazing woman at London University, shows how responsibility for food, Kelly Parsons, how responsibility for food is spread like a thin layer of jam across government. Now, this in itself, people say, do you need a ministry of food? What do we need a ministry of food? Well, it's not necessarily the problem. You have to cut government some way, and you are always going to have this problem. Whichever way you cut it, there will be this problem. But it makes life difficult. So to give you an example, when Boris Johnson was wanting to extend the advertising ban, which he got cold feet on in the end, of junk food to children, I saw kind of firsthand the then Department of Culture, Media and Sport lobbying on behalf of its clients, the advertisers, saying you're going to lose advertising, you're going to lose children's programs, you're not going to have any children's programs. And then you had DEFRA saying you're going to destroy the food industry, and you had health saying this is going to destroy us. And you will know, but there's a process called Write Around, where you send your recommendations around all the Secretary of State, and they all come back with changes, recommendations, and often policy dies there. Interestingly, George Osborne, when he did the sugary drinks levy, he did it critically through the budget, which is one of the few government decisions that doesn't require write-around. It almost certainly would have been killed if it had had to go through write-around. So what this requires is a very strong number 10. Number 10 becomes absolutely critical to this process, to getting things through. And when I was in government, I served under 5 Secretaries of State for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, and 4 Prime Ministers. And it would be fair to say that number 10 did not feel like a stable and calm decision-making body. So if you get through all of that, there's then one more barrier to effective policy, and that is lobbying. So we don't have lobbying, I don't think, I certainly haven't seen it in this country in the way that you have it in the United States. It's much more subtle than that. There are some bodies who are paid to lobby, so the IEA, for example, which is there to throw mud in the water, to kind of confuse and obfuscate. But mostly it's quite subtle. So I had a meeting with ITV when I first came into DEFRA about advertising to children. Michael Gove said, can you take this meeting? And they sat in front of me and they said, you can't do this because advertising doesn't work, which was an interesting line. I said, I hope don't tell your advertisers that. It might be difficult for your revenue model. It doesn't work, and we're never going to have any children's programs. And there was a meeting with Sajid Javed when he wanted to intervene, and Chris Whitty, and they had all of the kind of big supermarkets and food companies there, and they were saying, yes, we need regulation, but not that regulation. We don't want that regulation. And so when you've got those 3 other things, you actually don't need that much grit thrown into the gears of government to stop it and stop anything happening at all. So just to finish off, where do we go from here? And I think I'm going to separate environment and health. I was in Brussels 2 weeks ago at a regenerative farming conference, and down the road, the Belgian farmers were in good spirits, burning tyres and dropping manure outside various government buildings. And if you were to read the papers, you would think that the whole food and farming, the environment, if you're interested in it, environmental thing was being put on hold by farmer protests. And actually, I don't think this is true. I think it's being slowed down. But if you look at the reason for farmers getting upset, in every country it's different. And in every country it is driven by dumb policy, by policy done for the right reasons but the wrong policy. So for example, in Wales, they said that they were going to ask every farm to grow 10% of it, put 10% of its land into trees. Now that is not the answer for every farm. Some farms will need more than that, some will need less. You need a land use framework. You need to work out where you're going to plant trees, where you're going to grow food. In Germany, right at the top, after the Ukraine war, as prices were going up and up, they announced they were going to put VAT on red diesel, on the discounted farm diesel. So that obviously became very contentious. In Holland, they started, because they weren't hitting their nitrogen targets, they started force purchasing family dairy farms and shutting them down. So like, each of those things was done for the right reason, but just bad policy. And it actually made me think, with our trial, we haven't had those protests here in the UK, and it made me think that actually what I saw Michael Gove and then George Eustace doing was trying to land a plane on a very narrow strip. And I look back and think there was an enormous amount of skill. It was almost all thrown off by Liz Truss when she did the Australian trade deal and then branded as a growth department. But actually it's quite difficult. You need a real combination of politics and good policy to make things happen. But I am actually, if you look at the repeals of European laws, they're not that significant. I think this, because we now realize, because we don't think, it's not a luxury belief, climate change and biodiversity collapse have been accepted as real, and therefore we will have to act. On health, I am less optimistic. I think that it is quite likely, the junk food cycle is the interaction between appetite and the commercial incentives of companies. You can break a feedback loop by breaking either of those things. You can attack the commercial incentives of companies, or you can attack appetite. Semaglutide, which is branded as Wegovy or Ozempic, is an incredibly effective appetite suppressant. People lose, when they go on, at about 30% of their weight. A lot of people don't have the side effects that Stephen Fry reported having in the Times this morning, yesterday, vomiting 5 times a day. And it is one of the first of many. There are 4 or 5 that are in the pipeline. There's one that's pills, not an injection. And I think it is quite possible that we might end up drugging our way out of the problem rather than doing it with policy. And that is problematic because these hormones, I was talking to another very brilliant Cambridge scientist last night, plant scientist from the Sainsbury's lab. Hormones evolve by random mutation selection, and they all have multiple roles, and you basically cut off one hormone at your peril. He's like, there's something that's going to happen down the line that's going to go wrong if you intervene in this system in that blunt way. But I have recently been given hope by this man. If you don't know this man, he's 60 now. He doesn't look like this anymore, but he's a man called Eddie Abu. And he's gone from one. Has anyone seen Eddie Abu's Instagram? Okay, you've got to go and look at Eddie Abu's Instagram. It's great. So he's gone from 1 million to 3 million followers. And basically, he's taken the idea of UPF and weaponized it even more. So the reason I think UPF, you can argue about the science of it and how different the harms are to food high in salt, sugar, and fat. But what it's done is it's unveiled a truth. So when people talked about junk food, it's like, oh, it's my fault. Oh, I had a cheeky McDonald's. Oh, aren't I naughty? But it was a bit fun. When you talk about UPF, it's quite clear that actually this is the man fucking with you. And people don't like the man to fuck with them. Am I allowed to swear in Cambridge? Oxford, we swear all the time. I know you're a bit more serious here. So Eddie Abu's Instagram is basically him with a camera going through supermarkets. And it is just astonishing when you go down the Mother's Day aisle of just endless chocolates. And he says, look at this. Why are you giving your mother this shit? You know, do you want her to die? Do you want to kill your mother? Do you want to get your inheritance early? And then he turns to the camera and he says, Wake the fuck up. And I actually think that now the combination of Treasury seeing it and the framing of it being about the man means that we might actually, I've recently met Wes Streeting and Health and Steve Reed and Daniel Zeitner on farming, and I think we might actually get an attempt to do more than drug our way out of this problem. In summary, on both things and on that kind of big point about incentives, I do have hope that things have got so bad that actually that means we will get round to dealing them. We have woken the fuck up. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Henry. That was a wonderful, wonderful talk. So the script here is that I'm now going to have an opportunity. I get first dibs. I get to have a brief conversation here with Henry, and then we'll open it up for the audience. So you can be thinking about your questions while I ask mine. So this is a policy conference. You've given a somewhat what's the take on policy? You've talked about how a sort of conventional approach to policy making. You've indicated all the ways in which, at least for solving complex systemic problems, policy, the bar is just too high for policy to succeed, is my takeaway. And yet you've got some hope at the end. What should we?
So I think that, I mean, for me, the takeaway is, the major takeaway is, first of all, just be honest about what you know. You don't know whether a policy is going to work. And therefore, if you're going to try and get people to intervene, the story has to be really strong. And I think that if you look at a lot of policy wonkery, there's too much on the detail of policy and not enough on the story. And frankly, half of the stuff that we read, it was like it took you about 3 days to understand what they were saying. Mm-hmm. So I think that is really important, the story part. And then the second thing is, I think for me, it was recognizing how difficult it is being a politician and like how narrow that ability to deal with the nutters in your own party, people who are literally trying to kill you. Michael Gove, while I was there, he had someone, the guy who killed David Amos, they found his mobile phone. He'd been standing outside Michael's house for several nights, and then Michael didn't come home, so he killed someone else. So you've got nuts in your own policy, you've got people trying to kill you, you've got a kind of vicious press, you've got an even more vicious social media, and you're trying to stay sane in that. So it's very difficult. So I think you have to really think about how do you create the route for politicians to be able to deliver the policy. And then the other thing I think is really important is having it there, and that's what you do and others do, but like making those pre-packaged gifts. It doesn't matter. I remember saying, I was at this really interesting thing at the Sainsbury laboratory yesterday where they'd brought together regenerative farmers and gene scientists, because they don't really meet. And someone said, oh my God, I feel like we've been going on about this for years and nothing's happening. Well, actually, that's not true. If you look at elms, if you look at, all of that stuff was the result, the future farming framework. Mm-hmm. It was the result of 30 years of work that no one ever thought would happen. And then suddenly, there's a moment and it happens. So plug on and keep going and create the gifts for politicians to pick up when they need them.
That's great. In the cases that you found where real progress has been made, so you talked about South Korea, you talked about different countries, what was one great policy intervention that was there anything that you saw that you thought, God, I wish we could do that? That's brilliant.
Yes. Now, and this sounds, when I first thought about this, I thought it was ridiculous. So in Japan, they have a thing called the Metabo Law, which is about keeping people's diet healthy. They do all sorts of other things. They have amazing school meals, and all the children eat together. Metabo Law, one of the things is that at work, everyone has to get weighed once a year. And if computer says no, you then get referred to a weight loss course. Now, that sounds ridiculous. And we had lots of jokes about how maybe in the UK you could have a scale on the door to the office, and if you're too heavy, you kind of disappear down the thing. But actually, if you frame it slightly differently, if you say every company over a certain size has an obligation to offer that test to employees, we know that actually one of the most effective, one of the only evidence policies that works is that people do respond to coaching and training and advice. So if you did it in that way, then actually I think it's a completely sensible policy. So I think that just like doing the obvious stuff, but doing it in a way that's culturally sensitive to the context in which you exist, and that I think we should have our own Metabo law. And maybe over time we can introduce the compulsory weighing.
So I have in my notes here that you recently launched a venture fund that seeks to invest in sustainable and healthy food businesses. What's the thinking behind? Are you turning to the private sector for
so Bramble Partners. So what I realized two things. So in this transition, because if something isn't sustainable, it literally means you won't be, at some point in the future, you won't be able to make money out of doing it. So there will be a huge transition in profit from one form of activity to another form of activity. And the example we give in the book is horses to motor cars. And there's a picture of New York in 1903 and then in 1913. And in 1903, it's all horses and carts. And in 1913, it's all cars. And in those 10 years, you lost many professions that have been going for thousands of years: carters, wheel makers, fodder growers, even the cleaning of the streets, like the number of people who need to clean the streets went down. And so there is going to be a different way of doing things. And some of that will be captured by incumbents, but there will be innovation. Incumbents tend to protect themselves. They're not. And so we're trying to get capital to those companies that are small and innovative and want to make the food system healthier, more environmentally friendly, or more secure in the face of climate change. So,
and what technologies would you bet on, if not the drugs?
On health or on at
either,
all?
I guess.
Well, so I think in the agriculture side, there's going to be all sorts of stuff. So already data and algorithms are enabling big reductions in nitrogen use. People can see on their field exactly where they need to apply things. Drones can detect wheat rust long before the human eye can do it. You've got, there's an amazing company in the state that's taking phosphate out of rivers and pelletizing it and turning it back into fertilizer. It's like farming is probably kind of 10 years behind almost every other industry in terms of the amount it uses tech. And so there's huge, huge opportunity from all the things that are happening in the broader economy. But AI is going to, because it's a complex system, AI is or huge data is particularly useful in complex systems. So that is going to be massive.
Okay, that's brilliant. Just one more question from me, and then I'll turn to the audience. So as a behavioral scientist, I have to ask this question. If you've got some people out here who are passionate and want to do something, they want to intervene in this complex system, what's one thing they could do?
Well, so interestingly, we talked about, you mentioned the introduction, introducing cookery classes for everyone up to the age of 14. That is now a legal requirement. It isn't happening. And it's another interesting view. Like passing a law isn't sufficient to make something. And as people say, pass the law. It's not happening. And so I think you need to have both you need to change the fundamental wiring of the system with top-down legislation, but you also need care coming up from the bottom and energy. So I've got a charity called Chefs in Schools where we go and we help retrain school brigades to cook from scratch because one head teacher decided they wanted to make a change. And what I would say to anyone in this audience is if you care and you want to change, just look at the food system that's close to you, and that literally might be in your house, like eating a bit less meat, or it might be one of the when you go to schools who improve their food and food education, it was often because a parent asked to have lunch with the killed children. It was often like they don't have customers to saying, I want to change things. So just like look in your own world and see where is the point in the system that you can most affect and start there.
Okay, thank you. So let's take questions from the audience. So you back there, you raised your hand so boldly. You get the mic first, right here.
Hi, thanks. My name is Lucy. I'm an MPhil public policy student at the moment. So my question is, what do Lewis Hamilton, Venus Williams and Novak Djokovic have in common? And that's that they are all world-class athletes and they are all vegan. I'm also a vegan, but I'm not a world-class athlete. So you mentioned briefly about eating less meat, but I haven't heard you once use the term vegan, which, looking at your map of, sort of production, you can see how little, or how much the animal industry contributes to that. So just like to hear your thoughts about veganism and how we can nudge politicians and policy to encourage more veganism, as I would say that's probably the biggest solution. Thanks.
So two parts to that question, like specifically veganism, but also policy, and this is a really difficult area. So we need to reduce the amount of meat we eat on average by somewhere between 30 and 50%. Again, complex system, it's hard to put an absolute number on it, but you can't solve that equation of land, energy, biodiversity, and carbon if you don't reduce meat. And vegan, but that's an average. So veganism, obviously, if people stop eating meat completely, that's fantastic. But even if you stop eating meat 2 days a week or 3 days a week, I don't think that veganism is the only solution. It's obviously a good part of the picture. We asked on all of our recommendations, and for the political side, we actually raised some money externally and hired Isaac Vido, who is the Tories' spin doctor, who won the last election for them, to do all of the research on how these policies would be accepted and how they should best be framed. And I did that very consciously because I thought if I hired someone else, the government might just think that it was a kind of liberal, soft-minded, person who was just making it up. Whereas they knew that Isaac wouldn't make it up. And what Isaac concluded was that things like the sugar and salt reformulation tax actually would be relatively doable. And that was quite surprising to him, actually, and to them. I think in the context of cost of living crisis now, it was probably slightly trickier than then, but it's doable. People really hate what's happening to their food system. Meat was the opposite. Meat was an absolute nightmare. And if you had the rooms, the focus group rooms, meat would come up and they kind of crackle with electricity because you had such kind of, meat eating to some people in our society is, we are les roast beef. It's a kind of massive, amazing, weird part of our identity, as it is for vegan people. And any policy, if you looked at the policies on meat, it would be really, I understand why politicians shy away from that stuff. And we couldn't think of anything. So in the end, I'm now working with Channel 4 on a campaign to get people to eat less meat. Because I think that at the moment, the way things are, we have to try and rely on communication and industry. It's actually, except for the meat industry, and we don't have the meat lobby they have in the States, the supermarkets will make as much money selling less meat, the fast-moving consumer goods companies, and then you'll get meat alternatives, you'll get, powdered milk alternatives that don't go through cows that will come up. So I'm hoping that we can affect the change that way, because politically that is the one topic that was an absolute, if I was a politician, I wouldn't do anything on meat because if I wanted to keep my job.
Okay. Let's go here in the middle.
Thank you for your talk. I'm just a little bit confused because you mentioned that politicians shy away from the topic of meat, but in your 30 minutes, you also shied away from it. There's a lot of things about meat. For example, we waste globally 1/3 of our calories to feeding animals, and we get much less out of it. You mentioned Pekapuska. He had a specific program to convert dairies to berries,
Yeah.
but you didn't mention that. Red meat, I agree that processed food is a problem, but red meat is linked to cancer and diabetes. Dame Sally Davis, Master of Trinity, former Chief Medical Officer in the UK, has said that antimicrobial resistance will kill us all before climate change. And one of the leading uses of antibiotic overuse is in factory farmed animals, about 70%. And not to mention that the crowded conditions in which these animals live also creates the perfect conditions for zoonotic viruses. And so it seems a bit suspicious or a bit surprising to leave out these important public health considerations when we're talking about health and food, as you just did. And you also mentioned renewables versus fossil fuels, horses versus motor cars, and the role of governments and universities in creating markets. Yet you omitted the role of these institutions in creating alternatives to meat, using plant-based fermentation and cultivated technologies. And so this is where my question is, what is the role of universities and governments in doing that and making the case clear and why it's necessary to do that? Because yes, we can potentially try and change eating patterns, and that may be a very difficult thing to do. Or we could do as Henry Ford did and give them a better horse, or give them electricity without the downsides. So why not meat without the downsides?
It's a good question. I mean, there are in the food strategy, I think there are 14 chapters, and 8 of them are about meat. So we go into meat, and we mentioned the brilliant Pekapuska doing the berries, and he created cooperatives to freeze berries in the summer so that you could eat them in the winter. If you were to have a heuristic in the food system, like if you were to do one thing, and we said this in the food strategy, it would be, on the environment side, eat less meat. So that is the biggest single thing that needs to happen. Well, actually, on the public health side, the evidence is a bit less sketchy. So yes, it leads to colorectal cancer. There's some evidence on diabetes, but compared to other things, it is not the biggest thing. Maybe you could particularly process meat pretty hard, but eating a steak a week is not, compared to lack of insoluble fiber, sugar, processed meat, it's not. In fact, one of the things that I've found, and I think a lot of people make the argument for reducing meat eating on a health basis, because they say that framing works. People will do it on a health basis. And I didn't make that argument, and because I just felt it's not really the reason, and you have to be honest. But maybe that was, maybe I should have been more tactical. But so what is the role of government policy? So I think there is a huge role for science. I'm on the board of a company that's making pet food out of cultivated meat. So 20% of the meat that is eaten in the world is eaten by pets, and 50% of that is consumable by animals. So we're taking plants that are consumed by humans, feeding them to animals that are consumed by humans, and then feeding them to pets. Incredibly wasteful. So there is a role for innovation. I think then on the communication side, like the role for universities, I think you need to separate the two things. So I think you need to have one communication that is just really strongly linking, demonizing meat. So making people realize that this is a terrible thing. At the same time, you need to persuade the people who love barbecuing to eat a bit less meat. So the approach we're taking with Channel 4, rightly or wrongly, is it's not threatening their sense of identity. It's about all the ways in which you can eat more pulses, in which you can just and reduce the amount of meat you eat. But it's a very difficult topic.
Okay, I'm getting strong signals from over here that it's time to wind it up. So we will take this outside. Would you please join me in thanking our speaker?